At long last, we're going to take a look at the pen tool. I've mentioned a few times throughout the semester that it's possible to use the pen tool to create very clean masks and selections. It's actually one of the better tools for doing that if you have straight edges or hard edges. So on this assignment, we're going to be using it, which means it's time to show it to you. Now, there are a few things you need to do first, besides just having an image that you want to use the pen tool on. You'll also need to make sure you have your paths window here, your paths palette open. Now, this window can be accessed by going to Windows, Paths. I usually keep it near my layers and my channels. I should also give you a heads up, even to this day, Photoshop isn't as good at paths as Illustrator is. It's possible you'll run into a number of tutorials online that talk about how to do complex shapes and objects using the pen tool inside of Photoshop. If you do that, you'll discover pretty quickly that your computer starts to slow down, takes forever to start doing anything, and all of that. The truth is, when it comes to vastly complex paths on the screen with effects on it, you're going to want to go to Illustrator. Now, for doing something as simple as selection or a mask, paths in Photoshop are absolutely fine. In fact, they're an amazing tool, and so we're going to use them. So just keep in mind that if you're going to be doing massively complicated, like entire posters and greeting cards and things inside of Photoshop using just the path tool, you may want to actually use Illustrator instead and bring it over later into Photoshop. All right, that said, there are something like 6 pen tools, and then there are some selection tools you need as well. Let's take a look at that. So we have I guess it's 5 in the convert point tool. We have the pen tool itself, and using the pen tool, you can get to the add anchor point tool, the delete anchor point tool, and the convert tool. So it's very versatile and really pretty much all you need. You also have the free form pen tool and the curvature pen tool, and we'll go over what all of those do. But on top of that, you have the path selection tool and the direct selection tool. You'll need these when you're working with paths in order to grab the bits and pieces. So let me show you what working with the pen does. Let me first zoom in a bit, Z on the keyboard for my magnifying glass. Let's just take a look up on these, this dress around these shoulders. We'll start creating a path around all of this. So let's grab the pen. That's just P on the keyboard. Let me actually zoom in a little bit more. All right, pen. If I click here, you'll just see a point, and we get this strange thing occurring. It's a shape, and it has this little icon. That means that it's a vector. Let me click a little bit more, and I'll explain what all of that is. Notice if I click again, it's somewhat like the polygon lasso tool, where you can click a whole bunch of times and create something. But if I drag out, it creates this little bar going on. And what this is the direction handles and these little circular dots. I don't know how well you can see them on your screen. These little circular dots are the direction points. So you can actually grab the direction points with different tools, not the pen tool itself, to move them around. Now, one of those tools to move them around is the convert point tool. And I don't have to change tools to get to that. All I have to do is hold down the Alt key, and that will allow me to access the tool, and I can break this off and drag it around. So now these will be independent. Now you notice nothing seems to be happening over there. It's because the path is only on one side of the direction handle, so it's only going to affect that one half. So what does all that mean? Well, let me build a larger object and I can demonstrate. If I drag out, we get this handle, right? So I can keep dragging out and I'm getting these big, beautiful curves. So now if I come over with the little convert point tool here, and oops, I'll show you how to get back in a second. The convert point tool. Now I can move these handles independently to change how the curve is built. See? Fine and dandy, but what if you don't want to move them independently? Well, if you move over to the direct selection tool and click on one of these points, and these little squares are called anchor points. They're what I'm putting down every time I click with the pen. When I click on one of these anchor points, I can go over to my direction this is actually the direction handle, and technically this is the direction point. I frequently just refer to it as the handle. Most people do. If they're still connected, then instead of moving independently, they will move together. Or I could accidentally click outside of it. See how they're still connected? So they're moving, but the broken ones are moving separately. And that's because I used the, here we go, the convert point tool. Now, I could click once to switch it from a curve to a nice jagged edge instead, or I could click and drag, and I can return the handles to being connected again. So that's what that convert anchor point tool is, or is it, yeah, convert point tool does. It allows you to have the handle connected or the handle broken so that they're independent. It also allows you to remove the handles if you just want to go to one edge. And in fact, if I click on all of these, you can see that I can get a straight line. So that's part of the power of paths. You have the ability to continuously edit and come back and fine tune things as you go. So it's amazing, right? You're able to go back and re-edit this. So this might bring up a question, why don't we just do this all the time? Well, I mentioned that the pen paths tend to take up a lot of processing power and slows you down. And now you might go, well, sure, but why not just do this to brushes? Well, I need to tell you what a vector is. So essentially, what we normally are working in is bitmapped based work. So if I were to just come in with a brush tool over here and tried to paint straight on this shape, you notice that I can't. It just doesn't let me do it. If I were to create a new layer, I could go ahead and paint using my standard brush if I had this at 100% opacity instead of 20. And let me grab a color that you'll be able to see instead of a big gray. Let's just do this green maybe. There we go. So we have our normal brushes, right? And we paint and then that's it. And if we were to zoom in on this, eventually we'd get down to the pixel level and you'd see that it's essentially doing calculations based off of the color. And so it's filling each of these pixels with some amount of red, green, blue, and then it's keeping track of how many pixels up and down, and then it's got things like the alpha channel to create opacity change as it goes out to create that softness, all of that, right? That's just how the brushes work. Well, if we were to go in on this shape, it appears as though the same thing's occurring, right? But if we were to click on this with our direct select tool or any of our pen path tools, something unusual is happening. Let me zoom in even further so we can really take a look. Notice that this line is actually, oh, I've zoomed out too far and I've lost where I am. There we go. Notice that I should actually use a different color on this. Let me go ahead and adjust that real quick using the, let me get my pen. Now I should be able to simply change the color. Oh wait, no, I'm working. that's the Illustrator way of doing things. I forgot I was in Photoshop for a second there. Hold on. So with paths in Photoshop, what you'll want to do is go up to the fill and then pick your color that way. Let me switch this to green real quick. Yeah, let's actually use pink. There we go. That should work pretty well. All right, so we've got this fuchsia pink mix. Notice that the line is cutting straight across the pixels. Now that's something you normally can't do inside of Photoshop. So what's happening there? Well, I mentioned a couple of times that this is a vector. What that means is that it's a calculation. Technically, it's a Bezier curve, which is a very specific type of vector. It is a calculation that is occurring between those anchor points that we've been putting down. So it's recalculating on the fly and then storing that calculation how to create this curve based off of a graphic interface, these things that we've pulled around and clicked down and moved about. Now, what that means is that there is an infinite resolution, essentially. We're now only constrained by our display and our processor. With the right software, you could draw a little line and then zoom in forever because it's just a calculation, it's just mathematics, it will just recalculate it again and again. There is actually something a little interesting. Let me bring up a web page here. All right, so some of you may be familiar with the Nintendo Game Boy. This was one of the earlier successful handheld video game systems that allowed for multiple games to be plugged in through cartridges. I like to bring this up because it's exceedingly simple. If you were to play a game such as Tetris on it, it would have pixels that it could draw on the screen, and it only really had a few bits of color here. Essentially, it was either the green of the screen or kind of this black color, and then you could fill it in at different amounts to create these grays going throughout it. So it was somewhat of an on-off proposition going in. They may have had a couple of extra grays in the palette there, but essentially it was very small, but it gets the point across here, right? It's a pixel. It's the stuff we've been drawing all semester. So a lot of video games from this era did this sort of thing. You paint in some pixels. Now, they did some more things, sprite mapping and calculations and all that stuff that's beyond the scope of this class. But the idea is that you had equipment that would produce graphics inside of it, right? And it did it through essentially bitmaps. Now, there was another method for doing this, and that was using vectors. And this was the Vectrex, a vector display-based home video game system. Now, a vector, such as this oscilloscope, is, again, calculated by the mathematics and then drawn on the screen in some way. In this case, there was, I believe, an ion cannon in the back that was just drawing it out. So games like Asteroid in the arcade would normally have something like this, a television, but it had like a brighter, crisper feel to it because it was using vector-based graphics instead of the bitmap-based graphics. So the Vectrex was the home version of this, and it allowed you to play these strange sort of space games. Now, you can't really emulate these on your home computer the same way because it simply is a case of engineering. But what's interesting about this is that they would draw shapes using vectors. They would determine the mathematical points and draw them in. So computer graphics has actually been using vectors for quite a long time for a number of different things. But for cost purposes, things like bitmaps is simply cheaper and easier. So a lot more development ended up going into this sort of thing for graphics toys like video games than into vector-based stuff. But that doesn't mean that there was no developments going on. And in fact, vectors are incredibly powerful, and Illustrator uses them entirely. Now, that said, we do stitch it in. So we have more or less a vector being overlaid, vector object or shape being overlaid on top of our bitmap image, which is why we have paths. Now, on paths, notice we have a layer, and it's a shape layer. We can double click it, and you can do some color adjustments to everything, all that stuff. You could go in and change it, but whereas our pixel-based layer, our bitmap-based layer, we have channels creating it. Our vector-based object here has paths storing this information. And if you double-click on it, all that happens is it says, do you want to save this path? Now, the truth is you may need to. And in fact, this is a key for creating different selections between things. Now, right now, this is our working path. If we were to add in another shape, and here's something else. If you click, you can close this shape, and now it will behave as a single piece going in, and you can see how it will behave a little bit differently than this shape, because this shape, I'm on paths, I need to be on layers. This shape is not closed, it's an open shape, so it's trying to draw the completed fill, this color, and it's guessing for you. Whereas this shape, this new shape, is closed. And so there's no guesswork. It knows what you wanted it to do. All right. So now we're on shape 2, path 2. Notice the italics. Do you remember these back from when we were in channels and creating new masks? When we were in a quick mask mode, we would have an italicized quick mask, which meant that it wasn't stored. It was just being worked on. Paths is the same way. Let me get out of quick mask mode. Paths are the same way. We work on them and we get this italicized temporary path, but we can make a permanent path by simply pressing the new path button here, create new path, click that, and now this path is stored. And I can load it back in a number of ways into my image. But before we even get to that, let me cover the last couple of tools, and then we'll talk about how you can load paths in as selections. So we'll come back to that in just a moment. Let's finish talking about the tools that we have available to us. All right. So we have our path. Now you notice I kept clicking around to this direct selection tool. Or the path selection tool. Now this is different from the move tool, and on older versions of Photoshop, the move tool would just be a little arrow depending on how old a version of Photoshop you're in. Now they have this nice little kind of plus with arrows all over it, but you notice we get this black arrow with this little icon on here, whereas we switch to this one, it's just a full-fledged arrow. Now this is our, let me make sure I get it right, path selection tool, and it's A on the keyboard, and it lets you grab a shape and move that shape, and you can't really do any edits with this. You can either grab it and you have the whole thing, or you don't have the whole thing. Now this is phenomenal for moving something around without accidentally changing your path, and you can grab multiple paths by drawing a box if you have them available in there. But you also have the direct select tool. Now the direct selection tool allows you to grab a specific point. It will allow you to grab handle edges, and you can shrink handles in independently without breaking them, like you might end up doing if you were to go in and use the convert point tool. So the direct selection tool, which is the white arrow, will allow you to do adjustments to curves without breaking them into a point. And in fact, you'll notice if I try to pull it on top of itself, it still exists. It's very short. Another thing to keep in mind is you can twist these around, so you'll get these hourglass figures. Very rarely will you need to do that, unless you're just drawing for fun. You might want to do something like that. Holding down the Shift key allows you to select multiple pieces of your path or your shape, depending on how far along you are. And so you can grab different chunks, and then you can adjust your path accordingly. All right, so if you want to have a closed shape, again, you need to complete the path. So how do you do that if you've left? Well, go back to your pen tool. And then if you mouse over an edge, you'll notice this little star appears. If you click on that, oh, sorry, you don't want the star. That's a new path. So let's do this the easier way. I was going to try to show you the amazing way. If you just click once, you can grab it, but I can't really see what I'm doing, and I don't want to waste your time. So I'm going to click on it with one of my path selection tools, either the path tool or the direct selection tool. Go to my pen tool. Now, if I mouse over this and click once on the anchor point, I now have the ability to extend out. Oops, I've crashed my Photoshop. Oh no. Well, that's unfortunate. Let me pause the video here while I recover. See you in a moment. Okay, we're back. All right, now, as I was saying, it's possible to continue a path. Let me click on the shape, come in with the pen tool, P on the keyboard, press P on the keyboard there. Notice when I mouse over and Photoshop's working correctly, I get a small white square icon with two minuscule lines coming out of either side. If I click on it, it means that the pen tool will pick up the path and allow me to draw more path coming out. I'm just clicking to create corners. When I mouse over the initial starting point, it will close the path and it will indicate that this is happening by putting a little circle around the edge of the pen, the corner of the pen. Now, if I mouse over a point that I already have using the standard pen tool, it will, and I've done it again. So if I hold down the control key on the keyboard, it will grant me access from the pen tool to the direct selection tool. And I can click on the shape to get access to all of my anchor points. There we go. Now with the standard pen tool, mousing over an anchor point will allow me to remove it. Click, it's subtracted. Mousing over a path, or a segment as it's called because it's between two anchor points on a path, the path being any part or the whole of the object being the closed shape Whew. A lot of terminology there. Don't worry about writing it down. Just playing with it will allow you to get the hang of it. If I click on it, it will generate a new one. Control Z to undo that. I can also click and drag to create a curve inside the segment. All right, so that's just the pen tool. We're on the 20-minute mark, so I'm going to move on to the next video. We'll talk about some of these other pieces. Although the add anchor point tool and the delete anchor point tool is the same thing as just using the pen tool and clicking on different parts of the path or on the anchor points. These are nice because if you keep missing, it doesn't matter as much. You just get the remove anchor point, delete anchor point tool, and then boom, you can click on something. And if you've been missing a bit, it's good for shakier hands. All right, I will see you next video.